Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we discussed some applications of STEM psychology. In this segment we will use the idea of complex communication in order to address the problems related to abnormal communication in terms of mental illness. Previously the idea of a complex characteristic of communication was used to refer to an unknown or irregular amount of information being processed in a meaningful cycle of communicating. When considered a complex characteristic, the result of processing has the potential to become disruptive not only to the cycle of characteristic in which that abnormal amount of information is being processed but disruptive to subsequent cycles. Under this assumption, the influence of that complex process can become apparent throughout different types of communication in a way that can be accounted for using the concept of a complex magnitude. In previous segments, the idea that specific levels of psychological activation or specific characteristics can be composed with one another was presented. This process can apply to complex characteristics as well. In this sense, the composition of each complex characteristic between any cycle in which it may occur can be added up to account for the total amount of irregularity contributed by complex process. This sum of irregularity can be referred to as a complex magnitude. This complex magnitude correlates to some amount or irregular chunk of the sum of the cycles of communication which it affects. The sum of irregularity caused by the unresolved complexity theoretically correlates to some amount of excess or some amount of missing information. When addressing that irregularity or non-standard amount of information, one action to take would be to resolve that irregularity in a way that allows each of those affected cycles of communication to once again become subdivisible by the standard interval ratio unit of communication. In order to address this complex magnitude, one can use some form of a complex set of information. This is done to create some complex construct in a way that equals that complex magnitude of irregularity. This depends entirely on the irregular being experienced by the individual. This complex construct can be composed of things like complex shapes, complex intervals, complex rotations, all while meeting the requirement that the person experiencing the irregularity be able to experience the complex construct in a way that interacts with the affected cycles of communication. In theory, the exposure to the complex construct should give a resolution to the cycles of communication affected by the irregularity. In order to achieve this process, the complex construct can be moved in some sort of complex direction, with one direction tending towards increased experience of the complex construct and the other tending towards decreased experience of that complex construct. A tendency towards the experience could be considered a positively complex directly, while a tendency away could be considered a negatively complex direction. Furthermore, the accountability of these irregularities can be measured in a way that is addressable in a vector space. At that point, the application of physics and its measurements can be used to organize the magnitudes of irregularities being experiences as well as the magnitudes of intelligence or impulse being experienced in a constructive sense. These can be organized based on the communication type thought to be affected or being observed. Using the measurements related to movement in terms of speed, velocity and acceleration, the magnitude of the complex magnitude can be addressed as well as adjusted based on the preference for increased or decreased compression of some sort of experience. The measurement of silent communication can be correlated to a value of speed. There can be considered to be an acceptable magnitude of speed related to the constructive experience of silent communication. In intimate communication, there is a correlatable magnitude of velocity as well as the direction that magnitude, each of those providing information about the complexity or congruency of that type of communication. In social communication, the magnitude and direction are related to the acceleration of that information from the physical origin of that information to the point of communication or interpretation of that information. Essentially, every other type of communication in intelligence and in impulse can be accounted for using a complex amount of deceleration or as a complex jerk with discontinuous amounts of sorting leading to a termination or complete deceleration of each process. The complete deceleration of those processes could be correlated to a resolved amount of communication and, from there, considered to be a scalar multiple the standard interval ratio amount of communication. In any unresolved or irregular process, though, the tendency of that complex deceleration or complex jerk would result in some amount of continued movement discernible by a continued movement in some amount of non-zero acceleration. This can trend in either a positive or negative direction, and, as the discontinuity of the complex deceleration would be related to the sum of the factors being measured, any non-zero result in the consideration of those factors would be equivalent to the complex magnitude of the irregular process. In mental illness, these discontinuous magnitudes can be directly related to the extent of the illness or disease process. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss traditional mental illness from the standpoint of standard theory.